Evening, everybody, and welcome to the Stannary Wines Burgundy tasting. Nice to see you all, or most of you anyway, and please do ask questions as we go along. We've only got 6 wines to taste this evening, and I don't want to ramble on too much. So, yeah, lots of questions would be really good. Hopefully, I'll be able to answer most of them correctly. So we'll get starting. There's a couple of people we're waiting on to come and join the tasting, but they can hopefully catch up. Hopefully you've all received this weekend the full offer as well. I know it's a little bit later than expected this year, partly down to growers not quite knowing what to do with allocations and pricing this year. We'll talk about mainly 2020 this evening, but just to fill you in a little bit about 21, which is in many ways the cause of the problem and the delay in 2020 is that certainly white wines, almost none has been made. We have producers who've made between 5 and 10% of their normal production in 2021. So Meursault, Chassagne, Pouilly, all those things have been terribly affected by the frost back in April last year. And as a result, a lot of producers are going to hold stock back for next year. A lot of producers are allowing us to bring some over this year, but need to delay it to next year. So I think they've really been struggling to work out what they can actually release this year. So we've been very delayed getting the offer together. And actually, one of our main Chassagne producers has only come through with the allocation today. So luckily, it's very pleasingly, it was worth the wait. But hopefully, I'm sure Tom will send you details of that probably in the next 36 hours or so. So look, a little bit of background about 2020. I think I've spoken enough about 2021. I went out there for about 6 weeks, I guess mid-October through to mid-November, really. And also spent a little bit of time there just before the harvest. And like you, I was aware that it was a really warm year, 2020, and I was not expecting what I tasted. The wines are wonderfully fresh, really quite classic. No sense of heat particularly. The alcohol levels are, on the whole, very sensible. The acidity levels are very good. pH levels are very low. The overall acidity is really quite high. And actually, there's a really nice sense of terroir. So the heat really hasn't been a problem at all. Lack of water was a bit of a problem. So as a result, some of the quantities are quite low. There was a little bit of hydric stress in some of the vineyards. And also there wasn't that much juice in some of the grapes. Great for concentration, not so great for production levels. So generally, in 2020, the volumes, they're probably more affected for the red wines than the white wines. But whites are down a little bit, but on the whole, not too bad. But reds are down as much as 50% in places, which is really quite high. And again, making allocations very difficult. Being a warm vintage, though, they were able to pick reasonably early. Most people started round about, well, for the white wines, round about the 20th of August. For the red wines, maybe 3 or 4 days later. I think the earliest I heard was the 15th of August. There's always someone who likes to get out there early and sort of win the trophy for being the first to start picking. But I think 1 or 2 of the slightly shrewder producers just felt that the vines needed maybe another week or so. So whilst they were really anxious to keep that freshness, to keep that sort of classicism, if you like, in the wines, they also wanted to make sure they were fully ripe. So it wasn't uncommon for people to continue through towards the end of September, the end of August. 1 or 2 growers, of course, the late pickers, they still pick late. Some finished around mid-November, but on the whole, most of the work was done in August, which is incredibly early, really. There is a big difference, I think, in generalising about the two colours. As we'll see when we're tasting these wines here, the whites are very consistent, very fresh, really nice sense of terroir. People have downplayed the oak quite a lot, so they've allowed the wines to speak. They didn't want to, I think I've used it in the offer, they didn't want to what we call over-egg the wine, so lots of richness and then lots of oak as well, so they were very sensible there. And the alcohols are pretty good on the white wines. A lot of people around 13, 13 and a half, so really not excessive at all. The reds are a little bit more varied, depends on the village and depends on the vineyards within those villages, of course. So alcohol levels are a little bit more varied. Volume levels a little bit more varied as well. Obviously, where the volumes are perhaps at the lowest, sometimes the ripeness of the grapes has risen that much more quickly. And the wines are a little bit more powerful, a little bit more alcoholic. But on the whole, they retain much of the freshness that the white wines have. It's just they are slightly less consistent, slightly less easy to get your head around when you're just tasting a few random samples. But look, let's kick off with the white wines. And I say, please do ask questions as we go along. We've got 3 whites and 3 reds. Hopefully you've all got them in front of you. And the first wine we're going to taste is from Bret brothers down in the Mâconnais. So now the Bret brothers are the guys behind Domaine of the Souffrandière, who were one of the best domains in, I would say, in the Mâconnais, bought by their great-grandfather, I gather, back in 1947. So it's been going a little while now, fully organic. Some of the vineyards are now biodynamic. And then the idea of the Bret brothers label really was the success of the domain was such that they needed more wine. So they've been buying in grapes since 2001 and labeling under the Bret brothers label. It's all made in the Couverie in Van Zel, where the domain is. And the Bret brothers are, make sure I get it right, so Jean-Philippe and Jean-Guillaume, very classic French names. Very sadly, there was a third brother, but he sadly died, I think, in 2004. But his two brothers are continuing and expanding the range year on year. So where they're happy with the quality of the fruit that they're able to buy, for instance, they're moving into Beaujolais a little bit. They're really looking to expand because basically, such as their success, they sell everything they can get their hands on. So the first wine we're starting with is their Pouilly-Fuisse, the Terres de Vergisson. Vergisson is probably the area where the wines generally are the freshest, the most mineral. The hill of Vergisson is quite famous. It's a very steep slope with quite a lot of altitude. So the wines don't get too hot at all, and they retain a certain amount of freshness. That coupled with the sense of the rockiness and the limestone content in the soil is very important. So this is it. It's a blend of several different vineyards in the area. I apologise for my glasses, by the way. I bought some glasses along to this strange tasting room where I'm in, and they turned out not to be quite Burgundian ones, a little bit more appropriate for Riesling, but they should do the job nicely. Anyway. This is aged in oak for about 11 months, most of which is not new. They don't want to dominate the wine with oak flavours. They want that minerality to come through, which I think it does. I think some of the vineyards face north, actually, not south, so they're not getting too much sun. In a vintage like this, where it was very warm, that's almost ideal. They're able just to, because of being north facing, they're able to leave the grapes on the vines a little bit longer, so they can get full phenolic ripeness without getting too much alcohol, without losing any acidity either. So here, in theory, we should see really nice maturity, but also really good freshness. Let's hope we do. Yeah, plenty of richness there. I mean, in many ways, that's quite classic of this vintage. Quite intense, lots and lots of fruit, and then finishes with a really zippy finish. There's no heaviness. It sort of elongates the wine quite nicely. The oak isn't prominent at all, not overdone. in terms of longevity, this is wine. I mean, it's really designed probably to drink over the next three to 5 years, something like that. And I think with that balance, that won't be a problem. Possibly it will just close up a bit for, say, 6 months to a year, but I would think thereafter, this time next year, you could probably perhaps begin looking at that. If you had a case of 12 bottles, start drinking in a year's time, and have a couple a year for the next 5 or 6 years. But that's very fresh. And there we go. Look at that, very efficient from Tom there. He's put the name of the wine and the price. So there we go. And as it stands today, without wishing to sound like we're on a one of those shopping channels, there is still some left at this precise point. Whether there'll still be some left at 7:30, we will see. But I think that's very much what Bret brothers are trying to do with their wines: retain a sense of terroir, retain a sense of freshness and purity, and not have anything too powerful or too intense in a way. So just really nice purity. And there we go. So that's the first wine, and it's slightly out of keeping with the rest of the wine in the sense that it's the only wine that we'll be tasting today that isn't from the Côte d'Or. So I mean, those of you who don't know, we're Mâconnais is about an hour's drive really if you're coming from Beaune. So it's a fair way south, which again highlights the importance of the vineyards being non-south facing. Otherwise, they really could get too rich and too ripe. Right, so moving on to wine number 2. Actually, wine number 2 and number 3 is a good pairing, actually. Well done, Tom, for choosing those. As you'll notice, they're both from a vineyard called Remilly, but they come from different villages. So basically, Remilly saddles 3 different villages, a little bit in Pouilly, a little bit in Chassagne, and the majority of which, though, is in Saint-Aubin. That's where perhaps it's most famous for its Saint-Aubin Premier Cru Remilly, a big south-facing vineyard on a nice slope, very well-exposed slope, where you get very powerful, rich, ripe wines with a sense of minerality. By contrast, the Chassagne version is absolutely tiny. So I think it's about 1.5 hectares in size, and there's only 6 producers. So very, very different in that sense. Classic Burgundian wine in many ways, in that it's produced in such small volumes. Whereas most people who have Saint-Aubin do produce a certain amount of Saint-Aubin Remilly. Now, Bertrand Bachelet, he took over from his father a few years ago. He's still in his early 30s, so that still, for me, counts as very young. Really nice guy. Based in the village of Marange, which is basically in the southern tip of the Côte d'Or. So if you're driving south from Beaune, you go Meursault, Pouilly, Chassagne, Fontenay, and then you really come to Marange, and then you're into the Côte Chalonnais with your Roulis and your Mercuries. So yeah, obviously being that little bit further south generally, things like Marange are a little bit warmer. But he doesn't just have Marange, he has some Chassagne red, Chassagne white, some Premier Cru, and then of course he has this Saint-Aubin Remilly. The vines here are relatively young. I think from memory they're only about 7 or 8 years. So they're only really just the last 3 or 4 years been old enough to actually produce a wine. And certainly what he doesn't want to do with vines that young is over oak them. You want to sort of highlight their freshness, their youthful vigor, if you like, and using a little bit of stainless steel with some new oak barrels is the way to do that. Actually, that's for young vines, that's got really nice intensity, I think. Just a little bit of sappiness there from the oak, and that will disappear in time. So it's only just been bottled, I think, from memory. Not too much alcohol at all. I would think we're probably looking at about 13, maximum 13.5 degrees there. It's really quite sensible. There's no real sense of heat, and a really nice vibrancy. The balance there balance there is really nice. I think there's a slight smokiness, which is good, almost a flintiness, if you like. I think the key to this wine was him getting out and picking reasonably early. Obviously, being south-facing, the vines ripen relatively easily, so it would have been very easy to have left it too late. But at the same time, it would have been the joy of having a well-exposed site is that you can go in and pick early, still get the ripeness, but retain that vitality in the wine. I think he's done that very nicely. In terms of drinkability, obviously old vines would give the wine perhaps a little bit more longevity. So I think this is a wine, if it, in your cellar, you would probably look to start drinking in, say, 3 years' time, something like that. Capture a bit of that youthful vigor and freshness. But it seems to have, to me, the concentration and intensity that to go for another 3 to 5 years thereafter. So perhaps, yeah, look to polish off the case before the end of the decade, and you should be in good shape. And actually, just Tom there's put out wine number 2. So this wine is 198 in bond. So, but you only get 6 bottles for that. So, yeah, in fact, that smokiness is really starting to come through now. It's nice. Just a hint of reduction. Again, that will disappear in time, and I think we'd all much rather have wines that have a little bit of reduction at this stage than oxidation, which is not a good thing. So look, let's move swiftly on to wine number 3, the last wine, as it's so closely linked with this. I mean, it is literally part of the same vineyard, but it is just the part that is attached to Chassagne-Monrachet. For me, it's one of the really great vineyards of Chassagne, but because it's so small, because there are so few winemakers, it just doesn't get the attention it deserves. It's just above Don de Chien, which is another tiny but great vineyard there, which you also don't see very much. And it's very close to all the Grand Cru sites as well. This example is made by Bruno Colin, who's probably responsible for best part of a third of the hectarage there. But he still doesn't make very much, a handful of barrels. We're lucky to get our hands on a handful of cases. As you'll notice, the name Colin is not unique in Burgundy. There is quite a few Colins. We work with 3 ourselves. So we work with Bruno, his brother Philippe, and also Simon Colin, who is Philippe's son. So Bruno's cousin. Nephew. But like much of Burgundy, all the growers seem to be interlinked. All 3 of them operate in Chassagne. In fact, Seymour, Bruno's nephew, he operates out of a tiny little couverie just next door to Bruno. Bruno recently built himself a smart new operation in the centre of Chassagne, and he seems to be on really good form at the moment. It's not a huge domain, and he has an awful lot of vineyards. So this is a classic example of the makeup of his portfolio. I think from memory, he has something like 9 or 10 different Premier Crus, all of which he would make maybe between 3 and 6 barrels. A really big production for him would be something like 7 or 8 barrels. When you're talking 25 cases per barrel, so something like this, yeah, he might make 100 and 125 cases for the whole world. So by the time that comes to the UK, that's really small volumes. By the time we come to allocate it, it's even smaller, especially in a vintage like this. So let's just have a look at this. This ought to be quite different. I'm expecting it to be a little richer, possibly a little bit more backward, perhaps showing a little bit more oak, and showing a little bit more structure too. But let's see if it does look like that. Again, really nice intensity. There's a lot of fruit intensity there, a lot of really good ripeness. Certainly no excuse for having unripe grapes in 2020. whether you're making red wine or white wine, in fact. Yeah, I think it's, for me it's much more backward than the previous wine. It's got more density, a little bit more power, probably a bit more oak influence at this stage, more so on the palate perhaps than on the nose. But this is a wine I would certainly keep for quite a bit longer in the cellar. So while you're drinking your way through the Saint-Aubin, this should be tucked away, I think, aging quite quietly. But again, we're seeing really nice vibrancy and freshness beneath that slightly rich exterior. Touch of honey, but not too much, so that's good. It would worry me if there was any more than that. A little bit of stoniness coming through. I'd say really good freshness, and just. Yeah, I think just enough length to really make that quite an exciting wine. And it's the acidity that gives the wine the length there, and I think that's an indication of how well balanced that wine is. You would expect generally, if you're drinking Pouilly or Chassagne, for the Chassagne to be a little bit richer, a little bit more full-bodied, and that certainly is. It's not as delicate as maybe a Pouilly would be, but it lacks nothing in minerality and purity. It all seems to be there. So I think that's really nice wine. He has other, as I say, various other Premier Crus, but I think this is one of his most exciting. I think it's certainly indicative of the vintage in a really nice way. Other ones to look out for, I'm sure. I don't know whether Tom can type all of these on what's available, but I'm just trying to think what he has, what else he has. But it pretty much covers most of the Premier Crus and Chassagne. So yeah, Bruno is someone we only started working with about 2 years ago after we bought Domaine Direct, but we were, although we had a lot of Chassagne producers at the time, and good ones as well, we were delighted to have him on board. And as I say, now we have pretty much the whole family. So just before I go on to the reds, obviously if anyone has any questions about the white wines, please do shout. Just to recap there, so we had the first wine, the Pouilly-Fuisse, say high altitude vineyards, north facing. As a result, slightly later ripening, which in a vintage like 2020 is a great thing, so very vibrant. Then we had the Saint-Aubin en Remilly with the slightly younger vines, a very talented young winemaker. So nice, gentle intensity, but a wine perhaps to drink over the next 3 to 5 to 6 years, something like that. And then contrasting that with this Chassagne en Remilly, so from literally around the corner, but a much more powerful, intense wine that really could do with at least 5 years of age, and quite possibly will last 10 years plus. So absolutely no hurry to drink that whatsoever. So I think those three are probably quite a nice indication of the style of the vintage, especially in this price point. I think you still get that really nice sense of terroir. You still get a really nice sense of freshness. And something we noticed quite a lot when we were out tasting was how the winemakers have really adapted to the vintage. So in the old days, perhaps the previous generation, we've kind of done the same thing every year. I use 30% new oak, so I'm going to do that again. I pick on that date, so I'm going to do that again. And that isn't the case anymore. They really do go out and pick when the time is right. They're sensitive to the influence of oak, and they seem to get that about right. And I think as a result, and most importantly as well, they can also, their work in the vineyards throughout the summer makes a huge difference. So whether they keep the canopy to protect the grapes from the sunshine, or whether
They like to keep a canopy because they need to get more photosynthesis happening, so they get better maturity. They can do all that, and they're very happy to do that. They've had a good time of it lately, so they can afford in many ways to have a team who can be very, very reactive to the conditions. And so if vines need some work, then they can do that very easily. So I think, yeah, testament really to perhaps the youthful ambition that exists in Burgundy at the moment. I did ask one or two winemakers whether they think the vines have started to adapt to the heat, but very modestly, they all thought it was probably the winemakers themselves that probably adapted, perhaps more so than the vineyards. But I do wonder, I think most plants, if it's too dry or too hot or too cold, and that continues over a number of years, I think they will learn to look after themselves and protect their fruit. So we'll see. We'll see if they perhaps give the same answer in a few years' time, should the warm weather continue. Right, so let's move on to the red wines, and obviously please do type over any questions if you have some. So we're not going too far. We're just going to up through Beaune and then to Savigny-lès-Beaune, which is right on the edge of the borders of the Côte de Nuits and the Côte de Beaune, really. This is a winemaker we've been working with now for about 10 or 12 years, Jean-Baptiste Lebruiel, who took over again from his father when he was probably only in his late 20s, I would say. It's a small domain, small family domain, with producing about 7 or 8 different wines, mainly Savigny. It has a little bit of white Savigny, which actually is worth buying this year. We don't recommend it every year, but in 2017, it was one of Sam's great recommendations, and I think we sold out almost his entire production. So, and we think the 2020 is pretty much on a par with the 17. So look out for that. I think that's Savigny-les-Clous. That's done particularly well this year. But this is one of 2 Premier Cru Savignys he makes. So Serpentières is pretty well known vineyard in Savigny, fairly big, not that high up the slope, but pretty much in the centre of the vineyards. He also owns Les Gravins, which is just next door, which he bought around about 6 or 7 years ago. So fairly new wine for him. And the soil there is a little bit stonier. Here there's perhaps just a little bit more clay. And it's always interesting tasting the 2 wines side by side because they really are quite different. This tends to be a little bit richer, slightly earthier. Not so much on the darker fruits, but the Gravin is that little bit stonier and more mineral, whereas this is perhaps a little bit more fruit driven. Jean-Baptiste doesn't like using lots of new oak. The maximum he would use on something like this would be 20%. He's looking to make wines which are really full of fruit, but with a certain restraint, I suppose. Wines that you can drink over the next sort of 5 to 8 years, something like that. I mean, they'll probably go beyond that, but they're not wines that shut down for more than a year or two. So you don't have to wait that time. There's enough fruit intensity in them that they will drink after, a handful of years, really. So this is the 2020 Serpentières. And I must admit, I haven't tasted this wine since the end of July. I didn't get to see him in November this time, but the wines were looking pretty good early on. So let's see if it still looks good. Colour's really quite sensible, nice and sort of limpid and bright. Lots of vibrancy. Not too dark, not too black, which is great. Would worry me a bit if it was too much darker than that, but it's full of life at the moment, full of oxygen. And one of the issues for some people, I suppose, with some of the appellations like Savigny or Alox, which is just next door, is there are some vintages, if you take a vintage like 2011,
where they've struggled to get complete phenolic ripeness in some of the vineyards. And climate change has probably been the best thing that's ever happened to the likes of Savigny-lès-Beaune and Arlaud's quarter, because it just means basically they're getting really good ripe grapes almost every year now, rather than perhaps 3 or 4 times a decade. And what that means really is that the winemakers can pick more when they want to. So when the grapes have actually reached the maturity they want, they can retain that freshness by picking when they feel is a good moment. They can do slightly gentler extraction because the raw ingredients are that much more interesting. They don't really need to work it that hard. So I think we're seeing generally with these appellations a better quality of tannin. I mean, it's partly because the approach of winemakers, I think, has slightly improved anyway. But there's less extraction because everything comes much more easily. And as a result of that, you're not. I always use the comparison with when you're making a cup of tea. If you have to squeeze the tea bag a little bit too much to get more colour into your tea, you obviously get some bitterness from the tea bag. And it's the same with wine. If you try and extract too much, you'll end up taking the bitter tannins as well as the good tannins. I mean, tannins are a very positive thing, but you can overdo it. And I think when the tannins are not ripe, then you're getting on dangerous ground. So I think, yeah, someone like Jean-Baptiste has really benefited in recent years from the better climate we've seen. And now suddenly the rusticity of appellations like Savigny has very much disappeared, and the wines have become silkier, the tannins slightly more noble, finer, and possibly one might say more aromatic. There's still not a lot of people using lots of whole bunch in Savigny. I'm not sure they've quite got to that ripeness level yet, but it's something we might see more of in the future. But this to me seems there's a little bit of minerality there, and actually showing more red fruits than black fruits. Again, testament to picking at the right time, not letting the vines get too ripe, getting too comfy, and just being a little, quite gentle, not pushing it too much in the cellars. So again, the tannin is still there, but it's quite well integrated. Again, the oak is nicely done. As I say, he won't be using more than 20% new oak on that. And there's no, I'm not saying you want to drink that now, but there are no harsh edges in it. So whereas I think the Savignys of yesteryear, you'd have really struggled to get a sense of refinement and pleasure at this stage in their life, whereas this is full of balance and aromatic interest, and I think showing really well. Tony has just asked if we've got a price on that. As of about an hour and a half ago, we do. It's going to be probably 175 in bond, something like that. But that's for a 6-pack. So yeah, Jean-Baptiste just emailed through the prices over this afternoon. And this is a wine that even if it stays quite open, will probably age really nicely for upwards of 10 years, I would say. Ideal window is probably start drinking in about 5 or 6 years' time, and then I think you've got another, ideally 5 or 6 years, but I think you could probably push it a little bit further. There's no doubt there's good intensity here. And the alcohol was really nicely under control. There's no sense of heat whatsoever. I don't know the exact figure, but I would, if this is more than 13.5, I'd be amazed. It's likely to be nearer 13, I would think. And yeah, there's no real warmth coming through. Just really lovely fruit. And as I say, this was not the sort of Savigny that I used to have to drink when I was growing up. It was a lot more rustic than this is. Yeah, I say there is still some tannin there, but you would expect that, and you would want that as well with a young red wine. But it's not drying in any way, and it kind of lifts the palate rather than dominates it, which is, I think, exactly what you want. Okay, well, look, we're going to move on to wine number 5, so the second red wine. And we're not actually having to drive that far if we're heading north. So back onto the RN74, the main road that drives through the middle of well, the whole of the Côte de Beaune, really, and the Côte de Nuits. So this is from the southern part of Nuits Saint-Georges. So generally, as a rule, for those who don't know, as you're driving north, the really interesting vineyards are to your left, and perhaps the less interesting ones are to the right. That to the right-hand side would be where you have a lot of village wines, some interesting Bourgognes. To the left is where you have all the Primeur and Grand Crus. So here we're at the southern, just north of Savigny-lès-Beaune, the southern tip of Nuits Saint-Georges. And Nuits is divided really into 3 main parts. It's the middle, it's the middle bit, the northern bit, and the southern bit. The northern bit is the bit which is basically lies next to Vosne-Romanée, and the wines are very noble, very elegant, probably more in keeping with the style of Vosne than with Nuits. And the middle bit of Nuits is perhaps the most, certainly what we would all consider to be the most typical Nuits Saint-Georges. A little bit more powerful, a little bit more structure, needing of time. And that's where you would find vineyards like Vaucrin, Les Saint-Georges, Pouilly, Caille, some great vineyards, very classically Nuits, but perhaps a little bit less showy than those to the north. And then to the south, there's some really, really interesting vineyards there, but again, quite different in style. Slightly much prettier, a little bit lighter in style. Feminine is probably pushing it a little bit, but I think, yeah, just a little bit more reserve, if you like, a little bit more delicatesse and that's where you'd find really interesting, well, some great vineyards like Colin, which is obviously a monopole of Freddie Mounier. You would find Arlaud, again, which is part of the Domaine de l'Arlaud domain. And in fact, this vineyard lies on the other side of the road, opposite the Clos Larlo. So it's in a good location. It's just 50 yards to the east of the Clos Larlo. The official name for this, I don't know if it says it on your little bottle. It should say 1937 on there. That's the cuvée name. Basically, because most of it was planted in 1937. So making this kind of 83 years old when it was harvested. And Thibault hasn't been making this wine for a terribly long time. Just a little bit of background on Thibault for those of you who don't know the estate. It's a really interesting domain, based obviously in Nuits Saint-Georges. So he has a lot of his own vineyards, but he also has some contracts in place where he's buying in fruit. So it's a mixture of the two. He doesn't make too much distinction between them on the labels, so it's not always easy to tell which is which. But he does an awful lot of the work in the vineyards on both. So to a certain degree, whilst he doesn't actually own them, there's not as much difference as you would find perhaps in some operations between the Negociant wines and the Domaine wines. He's like Gouges, he's got a nice chunk of Les Saint-Georges. He makes Clos Vougeot and Richebourg. So he's got the top names, but actually he almost seems to get as much, if not more, of a kick from making these lesser wines, inverted commas, than he does the really, really grand things. This is aged in oak. To me, it doesn't particularly feel like it's aged in much more than 10 or 15% new oak d'Or. Let's have a quick look at it. Which is really quite quite a lot of ripeness on this. The colour is a little bit darker than the Savigny, a little bit more intense, a little bit richer, and actually the aromas are as well. The fruit is slightly darker. I would need to check with Tibo, but it would suggest it's maybe been picked perhaps a few days later. He's certainly got total phenolic ripeness there. Wow, that's quite a lot of wine for a humble Côte de Nuit. I think that's really where the age of the vines has kicked in. It's interesting because they would have suffered because of their deep root system. They would have suffered from the dryness of the conditions much less than, say, the young vines. Young vines of 6 or 7 years of age, whose roots don't get it down very deep at all, would really have suffered with the drought conditions and struggled to get water and probably just shut down for maybe a week or two. But these old vines won't have done that. They'd have still had access to water, and as a result, they'd have had no issue reaching full maturity. And I think that comes through. And Thibault's challenge there would have been to retain the freshness because he's got that natural concentration. So no issues with getting right there. Yeah, that's really quite chewy, quite dark, almost a little bit leathery. The tannins are, for me, a little bit in the background, so they're there, but they don't dominate. They're certainly not dry. I think the fruit content probably wins through there, and because of that, although it is quite an intense wine, I don't feel that wine will particularly shut down. If the tannins are a little drier, a little bit more forthright, it might do. But it seems so open and so fruit driven that I just wonder if that will pretty much drink really well from day one. Certainly plenty of wine there. Gives every indication that for a mini wine, it should last really quite nicely. Just see if Tom has written the price in there. So it's 168 in Bonn for 6 bottles. So not dissimilar in price to the Savigny, but a very, very different wine. If I was doing this live in front of you, I'd ask you all which you prefer. As you've all, I can't see many of you on video either, so we can't even do a show of hands. I think that's really interesting. I mean, Nuits was, I think, an interesting vineyard in 2020. It was probably one of the vineyards where some of the vines were, some of the grapes perhaps were the ripest and the most powerful in the whole of the Côte de Nuit. There were quite a lot of Nuits generally that were nudging towards 14%, perhaps more so than villages like Beaune and Gevrey-Chambertin. And I do wonder, especially in that middle section of Nuits, where I mentioned Les Saint-Georges, Vaucran, wines like that, I think it's probably going to be a very long-living vintage for those wines. They've got a lot of power, a lot of structure, and obviously alcohol as well. So it's probably not a wine, probably not a vintage to drink Nuits after a couple of years. So in a way, slightly old-fashioned Nuits Saint-Georges vintage. This, however, is quite the opposite. So full of fruit and pretty much ready to go now, I'd say. A couple of people there just mentioning they prefer the Nuits. Paul's asked whether the aging and balances ages on Thibault. It will mellow out. I mean, there's really good ripeness there. As I say, I wouldn't want to see particularly lots more ripeness, but I just think that will mellow. It just won't take that long because the tannins don't need to subside particularly. So I would say, yeah, start drinking in 3 or 4 years' time. But but there's enough. So there's enough fruit intensity for that to really age and stay balanced. That sounds like Alistair drank his 2006 Orea yesterday, so he should be all T-bowed up at the moment. Right, moving on to the final wine, which is the Morey-Saint-Denis from Arlaud. So we're getting back in the car and we're driving north about 10 miles, I suppose, something like that, from Savigny. From south of Nuits Saint-Georges, all the way up to Morey-Saint-Denis. So Morey lies next to, sandwiched in between Chambolle and Gevrey-Chambertin. There's some wonderful domains and some wonderful vineyards there. Probably a good moment, Tom, to mention, as we're talking about Morey-Saint-Denis, one of the great vineyards there is Clos de l'Ombre, and we'll be offering Clos de l'Ombre in March this year. So watch out for that. We're just trying to work out how much is going to be available for the UK market. But yeah, we took that out of this year's main offer, and that will be done separately. So Domaine Arlaud. Funnily enough, when I first met him, he was had cellars in Nuits Saint-Georges, but he was operating out of a winery in the village in Morey-Saint-Denis. And then in 2003, just after he took over from his father, I think the following year or something like that, very close, he built himself a massive state-of-the-art new winery just on the outskirts of Morey. And very well timed, of course, because he had his wedding reception in the winery just before all the cuves and vats and things were moved in. So very, very well organised of them. Cyprien is someone who cares at least as much about his vineyards as he does about his winemaking. He works biodynamically, has done for a number of years. And it's interesting the way his wines have evolved over time as he's not only become a more confident winemaker, but as his own personal tastes have changed. He said back in those days, back in the early 2000s, when he was 24, 25 years old, his taste in wine was very different to what it is today. I think then he liked quite powerful wines that was kind of had an immediate impact. And over time, his wines have gradually become finer, more delicate, be more about aroma often. And I think, very much reflecting his change in taste as he's got older. And it's quite interesting to see. And I think having the new winery has allowed him to have much more gentle extraction and really to work on this. A lot of people do now, and what they say infusion rather than extraction. So very, very gentle approach in the winery. He has been biodynamic. I'm trying to think for how long. He's been organic for a long time. He's probably been biodynamic for over 10 years. He has a small negociant business as well, and everything there is at least organic, and he's buying in fruit. And some of the vineyards are biodynamic. He's working the vineyards. He's doing the harvest, so he's really able to get the same quality that he gets with his Domaine fruit. That's a fairly new operation, really, basically because he hasn't got enough wine from Domaine to match the demand for his wines. So we've got his 2020 Morey-Saint-Denis. This is a mixture of various vineyards dotted around the village. Morey-Saint-Denis has long been, I don't know, not necessarily one of my favourite villages, but it's a village I've always loved to love, if that makes sense. It perhaps gets a little bit less attention than Beaune or Gevrey, but it has the potential to make really great wines, and I'm very much one for shouting for the underdog in that sense. I think it's where some of some of Burgundy's great surprises come from. There are not only great vineyards, but some great domains there as well. And yeah, the wines have a, I mean, it would be too simplistic to say there's, you know, there's a little bit of Chambolle in them or a little bit of Gevrey. Certainly they're a little bit more powerful than the Chambolle Musigny, and perhaps a little bit more accessible than a young Gevrey Chambertin. Generally, is a real sense of spice running all the way through them. That seems to be a classic Morey character. And I think the other good thing in a commercial sense is the wines tend to offer really, really good value. Both Gevrey and Beaune, because they're so high profile, can really charge what they like, and everyone's quite happy to pay for it. Morey's kind of had to earn its stripes, and I think as a result, it's priced its wines very, very fairly for the quality that it's producing. This Morey Village will probably exceed about 20% Euro. Cyprien harvested right in the middle. Occasionally had to start a day or two earlier than perhaps he would plan to, because he's now got quite a lot of vineyards to harvest, but he definitely doesn't like the harvest too late. So this is showing quite a smoky style on the nose, I think. Again, there's an awful lot of fruit there. Tannins are really nicely integrated. The acidity is good. It just gives the wine a little bit of a lift, gives it a nice piquancy on the finish, and just gives it a bit of added length. But I think, yeah, the tannin structure are what really keeps that fresh and alive. Without that, I think, yeah, it would almost feel a bit floppy, because there is very good ripeness there. So it's important it does have that structure to really support it. But I think it does. Yeah, mix of red fruits, black fruits, blue fruits even. Probably, having said how typical it is for Morey-Saint-Denis to be full of spice, this is perhaps less spicy than I would have expected. Wonderful balance, I think. Yeah, I've drunk quite a lot of old Arlaud over the years, and actually it's interesting, despite this lovely integration of tannin and lovely almost felt quality that the wine has, which is fairly indicative, I think, of Cyprien's style, the wines age really well. Ironically, they probably age better than they used to when they had a bit more power. So although they're more refined now, I think the balance is much better. So they actually age with more confidence and more grace than perhaps they once did. And this seems wonderfully together. Everything is in proportion. The alcohol is not too high. The oak is certainly not too high at all. Acidity is just right, and say that the tannins are really well integrated and they're very ripe. So I think this will age really nicely. We're only at village level, so it's not going to need 30 years or something. But I think this will drink beautifully in about 4 or 5 years' time. It'll probably drink really well for another 10 years thereafter.
Jason, evening. This is wine in the tasting for me. I think it's showing beautifully in my glass. Has he, and the last few years, he's really knocked out the park. Has he changed much in the last 3 or 4 years, winemaking wise, or just a sort of slow?
Not really. The only thing, he used to have quite a lot of reduction in his wines. When you tasted in the cellars, he didn't used to do a lot to them. So he would literally, they'd be left there. They wouldn't necessarily be racked. Racking is the process. You literally move the wine from one barrel to another to oxygenate it, really. You wouldn't do that. And so they would be quite hard to taste when young because of this reduction. and I haven't found that on the wines in the last 3 or 4 years. But that was always a temporary thing anyway. I think probably a lot of the work in the vineyards has done that. I think that the working biodynamically has helped. The wines, I think that's probably where we see the quality of tannins coming from. To get that quality of tannins in a village wine, I think is really great. But yeah, he's what is he now? They say he's 44 years old. He's probably at the peak of his winemaking skills. He's got all the experience of the last 20 years, but he's still got the ambition. So yeah, I think A, he's at the top of his game, and B, so are his vineyards probably. It's been, to use a cliche, it's been an evolution rather than a revolution there, and I think it's been just each year just a little bit better, Yeah, just picking up, I see Tom on the list of wines. He's obviously mentioned the Morey-Saint-Denis. There are various Grand Crus as well available from Cyprien. Sadly, they're all in terribly small quantities, but if you're very nice to Tom, you never know, he might be able to find you a little bit. But the whole range, I think, is from Cyprien this year is really consistent. Had a really good tasting when we were there. And all the way up, he makes, probably worth mentioning as much as the Bon Mar, he makes a wonderful Bourgogne known as Bourgogne Roncevy from a vineyard that could have been classified as a village, but it got downgraded to a Bourgogne because most of the people who had the vineyards there came from a different village. Well, that's so the story goes anyway. But it's kind of a Bourgogne with a village ambition, if you like. So that's the Bourgogne Roncevy. And yeah, that's particularly terrific in 2020. I think one thing you can say about this vintage is that in a way you don't, I mean, obviously all the top wines are wonderful, but it's really, yeah, the Bourgognes, the village wines have really excelled, as they so often do in really good vintages. They perhaps come up that much more than the Grand Crus. The Grand Crus kind of always good, even in a more challenging vintage. That's why they're Grand Crus. That's why the sites are so good. But it's really in a vintage like 2020 where you have wines like this, wines like a Roncevy. And when I look back at my notes and I was writing the offer, pretty much all the Bourgognes were tasting amazing, and a lot of village wines were best village wine he's ever made. So yeah, it's. I think I'm not that surprised this is showing that well. I take one or two people's comments about going back to the Thiebaud's one. I mean, it's possible that the samples just lost a little bit of freshness, but I think give that time, have a fully fresh bottle, and I think you'll be surprised. But I must admit, of the three reds, I think this is probably the one that's really singing today. And then of the whites, I enjoyed them all actually, but I think yeah, probably the Chassagne, but there's no great surprises there. Just checking, are there any more questions coming through?
Well, Jason, one from Tony. It's a really interesting question. The essence is these wines show really well in a little tasting sample. Will they be drinkable if you're drinking half a bottle with a friend or partner? It's a powerful wine, isn't it? A lot of these 2020 reds, and I think they'll need time to mellow to make them more drinkable in proper quantities. Do you agree with that, or do you think tannins are fine enough and the fruit isn't too powerful?
Yeah, I mean the two things I suppose that would really shut the wine down would be the tannins or maybe the acidity. And I think whilst the acidities are good, you still wouldn't describe it as a really, really acidic vintage. I think it's still, the fruit is still dominant over the acidity. So I don't think the acidity is particularly going to shut these wines down. The reason I'd be fairly confident, especially with a wine like Morey, that it will stay relatively lush, and not too tannic or not too closed, is because of the ripeness of the tannins. There's no dryness there at all. If you look at a vintage like 2011, where the tannins were much more rustic and difficult to manage, the wines stayed really quite angular and quite awkward for quite a long time. And then you had a small window where they opened out, the tannins softened, and then the wine kind of started to move into its tertiary aromas again. So I just don't think that has that. I think the evolution from a young wine into those more interesting mature flavors will be seamless, really. And I think the tannins are, as I said, they're so nice, they're so ripe, that there really shouldn't be an issue. In terms of, I mean, you won't get the complexity that perhaps you want for maybe 4 or 5 years. You know, if you drink this wine in a couple of years' time, you'll get very primary flavors. They'll still be wonderfully enjoyable. But yes, they won't be terribly complex. But I still think the wine will be very enjoyable, and yeah, there'll be no harsh edges. So I certainly wouldn't worry about that. I think the beauty of this vintage, it will have a very long window, very long open window, actually, which makes, you know, means you can buy them with confidence. Actually means you can drink them with confidence as well. If you've only, these days, as we know, everyone's getting allocated 3-bottle cases, 6-bottle cases. So actually choosing the moment to drink your wine is becoming more and more important. And I think in this vintage, it's a little bit easier, because certainly some of these wines are going to just be lovely, really, for much of their life. A little bit like 1985s, and I am just about old enough to remember drinking those quite a long time ago. So yeah, wouldn't worry about it, and I'd be pretty confident that you'll be a safe bet there.
A few winemakers are comparing the vintage of 2009 with more freshness. Do you buy that comparison?
Yeah, whether it is like 2009 purely because of nature, or I suppose that you say 2009 with more freshness. It's probably the main difference is the winemaker input. So they've had several hot years now. They've learned how to deal with a warm year. So I think, had 2020 happened in 20 years ago, no, 11 years ago, then it would have been quite similar to 2009 in that sense. But I think they've learned how to control it much better. So I think it's 2009 with a modern approach to viticulture and winemaking, I suppose. So the wines are certainly fresher. And people are wondering how it compares as well to 18 and 19. I mean, 19s I liked enormously, and it would be fascinating to see how they age. 2018 show much more power and alcohol than these 2020s as a generalization. And I think these 20s have a really nice balance and equilibrium that perhaps we haven't seen for probably some time. I mean, the 17s are a lovely, lovely vintage in reds. So these are a bit like 17s, but a little bit more intense, if that makes sense. So you'll get the longevity, but you'll, like this, as a wine like this, you'll get a certain instant pleasure as well. And that's, if you get both in a glass, that's a pretty good combination, really. I think that's pretty. We're pretty much done there, actually.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. We've gone over the hour.
Yeah. Any more questions? Doesn't seem like there is. So yeah, thank you all for joining. I hope you enjoyed the wines. I think they're a good indication of what the vintage tastes like. I know one or two of you found the Thibault's wines perhaps just a little bit over mature, but that might also be the sample bottle. Most of these were pulled from cask if they weren't bottled just about the week, well, either the week after Christmas or the first week of January, depends how much the winemakers were working, but we try to bring them out as late as possible to keep them as fresh as possible. So yeah, thank you very much. And Tom, do you want to wrap it up?
Only to say, Jason, thank you for hosting, and thank you everyone for joining. We just sent out an update, a link to the offer, which includes prices to Arlaud. We're going to add the prices to Thomas Morey, I think tomorrow. That still leaves 2 or 3 domains we're missing pricing, but hopefully with Jason's help, we'll get those by the end of the week. But that's a live link that will update throughout the week. We're holding off till Friday before confirming any orders. And for the smarter wines, please get your orders in by the 3rd of Feb, and then we'll allocate well a week or so after that. But it's such a great year. I've yet to see. I've been doing this since 2007, and every year I say the same thing. I'm always amazed how many people get sucked into the vintage. I mean, but this is an easy one to get sucked into because it's a unique year. This intensity of fruit, freshness. I've not tried anything like it before. They're beautiful wines, the red and white, and so again with half an eye on 2020-21, I can see why people want to get these in the cellar. We'll do our best to mimic your order you put in, but give us time to allocate. Please put your order in the next week or so, and then we'll come back to you. Jason, thank you very much. See you for the Christmas party in 2 days' time,
which is almost as late as the offer.
Thank you all for coming.